Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you are an astronaut. You are looking down at the Earth from 200 miles up. Below you, the continent of Europe slides past. Green fields, brown mountains, silver rivers threading through valleys that have held human life for 10,000 years. And then you see it. A shape, perfect, geometric, so precise it looks like it was drawn on the landscape with a compass and a ruler by a hand the size of a god. A star. Not a rough approximation of a star, a mathematically exact star with 9 identical points radiating outward from a central hub, surrounded by a moat of water that traces the star's outline with total fidelity. You zoom in, and you realize this is a city. People live here. They have been living here for 400 years. Streets run between those geometric walls. A church sits at the center of the hexagonal plaza. Children walk to school along avenues that follow angles calculated to the fraction of a degree. This is Palva, Italy, and it is one of hundreds of structures on every habitable continent on Earth. Structures that share a geometry so precise, so consistent, so eerily identical across thousands of miles and dozens of cultures that when you lay their blueprints on top of one another, they align, they overlap, they fit. The official explanation is that these are star forts, bastioned fortifications built by European military engineers between the 15th and 18th centuries to withstand the age of cannon fire. And that explanation is logical. It is documented. In many ways, it is compelling. But it does not silence a question that grows louder the more you look. A question that millions of people around the world are now asking. A question that this film will not pretend to answer, but refuses to stop asking. Why do they all look the same? Stay with us, because what follows is not a conspiracy theory. It is not a fairy tale about ancient aliens or hidden empires. It is something more uncomfortable than that. It is an honest investigation into what we know, what we don't know, and what we have perhaps been too comfortable not asking. By the end of this film, you will not look at a map the same way again. Let us begin with what no one disputes. Let us begin with the shapes themselves. In the year 1593, 2 star forts were built, one in northeastern Italy, one in the marshlands of the Dutch-German border. 2 different countries, 2 different military commanders, 2 different teams of engineers who had never met each other and would never meet. 2 different landscapes, 2 different strategic challenges, 2 different cultural contexts. The same year, the same shape. This is either a remarkable coincidence of parallel engineering logic, or it is a thread. And if you pull on threads, sometimes the whole fabric comes apart. Palmanova sits in the Friuli region of Italy, and from above, it is one of the most breathtaking human-made objects on the planet. Not breathtaking the way the Colosseum is breathtaking, enormous and ancient and draped in history. Breathtaking in a different way. Breathtaking the way a mathematical proof is breathtaking, the way a perfect crystal is breathtaking, the way something that should not be possible and yet plainly is, takes the breath away. 9 bastions, 9 perfectly identical triangular points extending outward from the central structure, separated by equal angles of exactly 40 degrees. The moat that surrounds the star follows its outline so precisely that from above, The water appears to have been poured into a mold. 3 rings of streets radiate outward from the central hexagonal plaza. The proportions between the inner ring, the middle ring, and the outer walls follow a consistent geometric ratio throughout. And here is the detail that stops many engineers and architects in their tracks. The deviation from perfect symmetry across the entire structure, a structure nearly 1 kilometer in diameter, is less than half a degree. Less than half a degree. Without satellites, without computers, without laser surveying equipment. In 1593. They built this with chains, ropes, wooden stakes, and mathematics. And then, and this is the part the tour guides tend to gloss over, they almost immediately stopped using it. Palmanova sat essentially empty for decades. The Venetian Republic offered land grants, tax exemptions, even pardons to convicted criminals in a desperate attempt to attract settlers willing to live inside their perfect military masterpiece. Almost no one came. The city that took years to build, that cost a fortune to engineer, that required the labor of thousands, stood silent. Why do you build something this perfect and then abandon it? 4,000 kilometers to the northwest, Bourtange tells a different story, but the same shape. The Dutch engineers who built this fort in the boggy borderlands between the Netherlands and Germany were solving a specific military problem: how to control the only strip of dry ground through an otherwise impassable swamp. Tactically, the location makes sense, but the execution goes far beyond what tactics demanded. 5 bastions, perfectly symmetrical around a central pentagon. The moat system is a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering, a series of channels, sluices, and water gates that could be manipulated to flood or drain sections of the surrounding terrain. The earthworks required to build this structure in a swamp where every cubic meter of displaced earth immediately wants to sink, slide, or dissolve, represent a feat of civil engineering that modern contractors openly admire. And then there is the fortress that sits in the river at the heart of one of Europe's great imperial cities. Petropavlovskaya Krepost, the Peter and Paul Fortress on Zayachi Island in the Neva River, St. Petersburg. Built in 1703 by order of Tsar Peter the Great, with French and German engineers directing the labor of tens of thousands of Russian workers. 6 bastions, perfect radial symmetry, the river on 2 sides providing natural moat coverage. The walls built so thick, some sections more than 2 meters of masonry over earthen ramparts, that they absorbed cannon fire without cracking. The fortress was never taken. It was never even seriously threatened. In its entire 300-year history, it was used primarily not as a military installation, but as a political prison. Its most famous inmates include Dostoevsky, Lenin's brother Alexander, and the son of Peter the Great himself. A prison shaped like a star, in a city that would become the cultural capital of a continent, built on an island in a river, in a location that demanded extraordinary engineering to achieve, at a cost that would be staggering even by modern standards. Look at the map. Really look at it. Palmanova in Italy, Bourtange in the Netherlands, Petropavlovskaya in Russia, Fort Gaul in Sri Lanka, Fort Jesus in Mombasa, the Castillo de San Marcos in Florida, the Star Fort in Stellenbosch, South Africa, the Red Fort in Delhi, the star-shaped Matsuyama Castle in Japan. The dots are everywhere, and they are all the same shape. Before we go any further, we owe the evidence its due. The mainstream explanation for star forts is not a lazy one. It is the product of 5 centuries of military history, architectural analysis, and documented engineering tradition. It deserves to be understood clearly because you cannot evaluate an alternative theory without first understanding what it is an alternative to. The story begins with a disaster. In May 1553, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II deployed a cannon so large it required 60 oxen to move. That cannon, and the dozens of others like it that surrounded the walls of Constantinople, ended 1,000 years of Byzantine civilization in 53 days. Walls that had repelled every attacker for a millennium, walls that were by every measure of medieval military engineering impregnable, crumbled under artillery fire. The message was heard in every capital city in Europe. High walls are now a liability. A tall stone wall is a target. The thicker and taller you build it, the more catastrophically it fails when a cannonball finds a crack. Military engineers across Italy began working on the problem almost immediately. What they developed over the following decades was a revolution in fortification design. The solution was counterintuitive: build lower, build wider, build at angles. Low, thick earthen ramparts absorbed cannon fire rather than shattering under it. Earth, it turns out, is one of the best materials in the world for stopping a cannonball, far better than stone because it deforms rather than fractures. A cannonball that would blow a hole through a medieval stone wall simply buries itself in a thick earthen bank. But the true genius of the new design was in the geometry. The old medieval towers were round, and round towers created a fatal problem. The walls on either side of the tower were in a dead zone, a strip of ground that defenders in the tower could not cover with fire. Attackers learned to exploit these blind spots, hugging the base of walls where they were safe from the men above them. The angled bastion eliminated the dead zone entirely. By pushing triangular projections outward from the main walls, engineers created a geometry in which the defenders on one bastion could fire directly along the face of the adjacent bastion wall. Every inch of the outer perimeter was covered. There was no longer any place to hide. On paper, the solution is elegant. In practice, it worked so well that it changed the entire balance of power in European warfare. Cities that had star forts could hold out for months against armies far larger than their garrisons. Cities without them fell in days. The Trace Italienne, the Italian method, as historians call it, spread across Europe with the speed of military survival instinct. The names attached to this tradition are not anonymous. They are among the most celebrated engineers in history. Michelangelo himself designed the fortifications of Florence in 1527, incorporating early bastion principles into the hillside defenses of the city. Francesco di Giorgio Martini wrote detailed treatises on bastion geometry that were studied by military commanders across the continent. And above all, Sébastien Leprest Vauban, the chief military engineer of Louis XIV, brought the Star Fort to its absolute apex of refinement. Vauban built or redesigned more than 160 fortifications across France and its territories. He did not simply build star forts, he theorized them. He wrote extensively about the mathematical relationships between bastion angles, the optimal width of moats, the placement of outworks and ravelins. His fortifications at Neuf-Brisach, Lille, and Briançon still stand today, and they are so significant that 17 of them are collectively recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The paper trail is extraordinary. We have Vauban's blueprints, we have his letters, we have the contracts he signed, the arguments he made to the king, the labor schedules he drew up for the thousands of workers who moved the earth. The history of Vauban's fortifications is one of the best documented engineering stories of the pre-industrial age. And this is the strongest argument for the mainstream view. The documentation exists. For the major star forts of Europe, we know who built them, when, for whom, at what cost, using what methods. The chain of evidence is long and it is intact. But, and this is a significant but, the documentation is not complete for every star fort on Earth, not by a long way. Historians are comfortable with gaps. History is full of gaps. The absence of a written record does not mean an event did not occur. It means the record was lost, or was never made, or was made in a language we haven't translated, or in a medium that didn't survive. Gaps are normal, but some gaps are more interesting than others. Consider the question of precision. We accept that Renaissance engineers were brilliant mathematicians. We accept that they had sophisticated surveying tools for their era, theodolites, measuring chains, astrolabes. We accept that they could achieve remarkable accuracy. And yet, how remarkable is too remarkable? The 9-pointed star of Palma Nova, across a diameter of nearly 1 kilometer, deviates from perfect geometric symmetry by less than half a degree. To achieve that, working in 1593, surveyors would have needed to establish a precise center point, measure equal radial distances to 9 points with exceptional accuracy, verify those measurements repeatedly, and then coordinate the labor of thousands of workers over years of construction, all while maintaining that initial precision throughout. It is possible. Engineers at the time were capable of it. But it requires us to believe they were operating at the absolute outer limit of what their instruments and methods could achieve, and that they achieved it flawlessly on the first try. No iterations, no visible corrections, no evidence of the kind of adjustment and error that usually marks any project of this complexity. Some researchers find this implausible, not impossible, implausible. There is a difference. Then there's the question of scale. Fort Bourtange, in its marshland setting, required the excavation and redistribution of an estimated 400,000 cubic meters of earth. That is a volume equivalent to roughly 100 Olympic swimming pools moved by hand in a swamp over a period of years. The moat system alone, the channels, the sluices, the dikes, represents hydraulic engineering of significant sophistication. For Bourtange, we have documentation. We know it was ordered by William of Orange in 1780 and completed in the early 1790s. We know the general military purpose. We have maps from the period. But the detailed engineering records, the surveys, the calculations, the labor accounts, are sparse in comparison to the complexity of the finished structure. This is not unusual for the period. Record-keeping was inconsistent, records were destroyed, archives were lost to fire and flood and war. Absence of detailed records proves nothing, but it does mean that when we say we know how Bourtange was built, we are partly extrapolating from what we know about similar projects, and partly trusting that the documented explanation is complete. And then there's the global distribution. This is the pattern that most resists easy explanation. The Trace Italienne traveled with European colonial power. That is documented. Portuguese engineers built star forts in India, in Brazil, in Africa. Dutch engineers built them in Sri Lanka, in South Africa, in the Caribbean. British engineers built them on every coast their empire touched. The geometry went wherever the cannons went. This explains the wide distribution of European-style star forts in colonial territories, but it does not explain everything. In Siberia, far beyond the reach of the documented European engineering tradition, in territories that Russia was only beginning to explore in the 17th century, there are earthwork structures with geometric properties that archaeologists have struggled to explain within the standard colonial diffusion model. The Archeim complex in the Ural steppe, dating to approximately 2,000 years before the Common Era, is a circular fortified settlement with radial geometry that some researchers compare to early bastion principles. Archeim is not a star fort, but it is a precisely engineered geometric fortification of striking mathematical elegance built 4,000 years ago in the middle of a steppe. In the American Midwest, The Newark earthworks in Ohio, built by the Hopewell culture roughly 2,000 years ago, encompass geometric forms across an area larger than the city of Newark itself. Circles, octagons, parallel walls, all laid out with a precision that has led modern surveyors to conclude that the Hopewell engineers understood and could replicate the lunar standstill cycle, an astronomical event that repeats every 18.5 years. These are not star forts, but they raise the question that lies at the heart of this documentary. What do we actually know about the geometric capabilities of pre-modern human cultures? What if precise geometry is not a product of a specific historical moment, the European Renaissance, but a recurring discovery, a capability that emerges independently in multiple cultures across multiple millennia, because the mathematics is always there, waiting to be found? Or, and here's where we must tread carefully, what if the geometry was not discovered independently at all? The word is Tartaria. And before you dismiss it, before you file it alongside flat Earth and moon landing denial, give it 60 seconds, because the word has a history, a real one. Open almost any European map made between 1300 and 1800 and look east of Moscow. Look at the vast territory stretching from the Volga River to the Pacific Ocean. You will see it written across the land in large letters, Tartaria, or Tartary, or Grand Tartary. The cartographers of the Renaissance and Enlightenment, Ortelius, Mercator, Hondius, Blau, the mapmakers whose work defined European geographical knowledge for centuries, consistently labeled this territory as Tartaria. It was not a fantasy. Tartaria, in the mainstream historical understanding, was a geographic and ethnic designation for the diverse collection of Turkic and Mongolic peoples who inhabited the Eurasian steppe. The name derived from the Tartars, the peoples who had swept west under the banner of Genghis Khan in the 13th century and left a memory in the European imagination so catastrophic that a folk etymology connected their name to Tartarus, the Greek underworld. They came, it was said, from hell itself. Over time, the label expanded. Muscovite Tartary encompassed the Siberian territories that Russia was absorbing. Chinese Tartary labeled Manchuria and Mongolia. Independent Tartary named the Central Asian Khanates that remained outside both Russian and Chinese control. At its broadest, Tartaria on European maps was the largest labeled territory on Earth, stretching from Eastern Europe to Japan. And then, with remarkable speed, it vanished. Between approximately 1700 and 1850, the name Tartaria disappeared from European maps. Russia's expansion east, China's absorption of its northern territories, the consolidation of Central Asian Khanates, these geopolitical changes were real and documented. The regions that had been labeled Tartaria were absorbed into other political entities. New names appeared, old labels faded. This is, by itself, unremarkable. Political geography changes, names change, borders change. The fact that Tartaria as a cartographic label disappeared from maps is no more mysterious than the fact that the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire also disappeared from maps. Empires end, names change. But in the early 21st century, a growing community of researchers began asking a different question about Tartaria, not about the name or the cartographic tradition or the political history, but about what the name might have been concealing. The alternative Tartaria theory, and we want to be absolutely clear that this is a theory, not an established historical fact, and that mainstream academia does not accept it, proposes that Tartaria was not merely a label for steppe nomads. It proposes that Tartaria was a civilization, a sophisticated, technologically advanced civilization with a coherent culture, a distinctive architectural tradition, and an urban geography that spanned Eurasia. a civilization that was deliberately erased from the historical record in the 18th and 19th centuries, during the period when the Russian Empire was consolidating its control over the vast Siberian territories that Tartaria had occupied. The theory draws its evidence primarily from three sources: the cartographic record showing Tartaria as a distinct political entity on maps for 5 centuries, architectural analysis pointing to stylistic similarities between major structures in Russia and Central Asia, and what proponents describe as anomalies in the historical timeline. Dates that don't add up, constructions that seem too sophisticated for their supposed period, buildings that appear in locations without adequate explanation of how they got there. The connection to star forts comes from geography and geometry. Many of the most elaborate star fort complexes in the world, including the Peter and Paul Fortress in St. Petersburg, the Kremlin fortifications of Pskov, Izborsk in Smolensk, and dozens of smaller fortified structures across Russia and Central Asia, are located in territories that old maps labeled as Tartarian. Alternative researchers point to the precision and scale of these structures and ask, does this look like the work of a culture we have dismissed as nomadic? Does this look like military engineering invented from scratch in the 16th century? For proponents of the theory, the star fort is not a product of the European military revolution. It is a remnant, a leftover, a structure whose origins predate the narrative we have been given, a narrative written, like all history, by the winners. We want to be honest with you about where the evidence stands. There is no peer-reviewed archaeological study confirming the existence of a pre-modern Tartarian supercivilization. There are no recovered artifacts, no deciphered documents, no stratigraphic evidence placing a lost civilization in the Eurasian steppe before the documented historical period. The Tartaria theory, as it circulates online, contains significant historical errors, misread maps, misattributed photographs, and logical leaps that do not survive careful scrutiny. And yet, the questions it asks, even when the answers it proposes are wrong, are not always the wrong questions. The precision is real, the scale is real, the distribution is real, the gaps in the documentation are real. Something about star forts invites inquiry, and inquiry, even imperfect inquiry, is not the enemy of knowledge. Let us explore 3 other interpretive frameworks that have been applied to star forts, frameworks that are, in their different ways, asking the same underlying question: what if these structures mean something beyond what official history has assigned them? The first interpretation concerns symbolic geometry. It begins with a simple observation. The shapes used in star fort design appear repeatedly in the sacred architecture of cultures across the world and across time. The pentagram, 5-pointed star, appears in Pythagorean mathematics, in Masonic symbolism, in Kabbalistic mysticism, in Islamic geometric art. The hexagram, 6-pointed star, is the Star of David, but also appears in Hindu yantra diagrams, in Buddhist mandalas, in alchemical illustrations. The 9-pointed star of Palmanova echoes the Baha'i symbol and appears in the geometric traditions of Islamic architecture in Persia and Central Asia. Is this coincidence? The rationalist answer is yes. These shapes arise naturally from simple geometric constructions, and any culture that experiments with geometry will encounter them. A compass and a straight edge, applied consistently, will generate pentagons and hexagons and 9-pointed stars without any mystical intent. But some researchers propose a different reading, that these shapes were not discovered independently by each culture, but that they were transmitted, that they carry meaning, specific, intentional, shared meaning across cultures and across centuries, that the builders of star forts were not merely solving a military problem, but were participating in a sacred geometry tradition that stretches back to Pythagoras, to Egypt, perhaps further. The Pentagon in Washington, D.C. is a 5-pointed star when viewed from above. It was designed and built in 1941 during a period of intense Masonic influence on American civic architecture. Its architects never offered a public explanation of why this shape was chosen for the world's largest office building. Efficiency? Perhaps, but the shape is also, unmistakably, a star fort. The second interpretation is more speculative but increasingly discussed in independent research communities, the resonance hypothesis. This proposes that star forts were designed, or at the minimum, that their geometry makes them capable of functioning as resonance structures, structures that interact with the natural electromagnetic and acoustic properties of the Earth in ways that go beyond military engineering. The hypothesis draws on real physics. Certain geometric forms do interact with electromagnetic radiation and acoustic waves in predictable and sometimes dramatic ways. Whispering galleries, curved architectural spaces where a whisper spoken at one focus point is clearly audible at another, hundreds of feet away, demonstrate that geometry can focus sound with remarkable precision. Ancient monuments like Stonehenge and Newgrange have been shown to have acoustic properties that their builders almost certainly understood. Some megalithic structures interact with specific radio frequencies in ways that researchers have documented but not fully explained. The resonance hypothesis asks what if the star shape was not chosen for its military geometry alone, but because it also created specific resonant properties in the structure itself? What if the moat of water surrounding the star was not merely a physical obstacle, but a conductor? What if the earthworks, the stone, the water in the geometry combined to create a structure that interacted with the Earth's natural electromagnetic field in ways its builders understood and we have forgotten? There is no confirmed scientific evidence for this hypothesis as applied to star forts specifically. It remains at present in the realm of informed speculation, but it is the kind of speculation that deserves controlled investigation rather than dismissal.
The third alternative interpretation sits closest to the mainstream and is perhaps the most likely to eventually receive serious academic attention. Call it the infrastructure first theory. It proposes that in at least some cases, the elaborate moat and water channel systems associated with star forts did not exist in service of the military design, but preceded it. Consider what a star fort moat system actually does. In the Netherlands, the Dutch masters of hydraulic engineering used their star fort moats as integral components of regional water management infrastructure. They drained farmland, they fed mill wheels, they controlled river flooding, they created navigable waterways for the transport of goods. In some cases, the agricultural and commercial value of these water systems was greater than their military value. The infrastructure first theory asks what if, in some locations, the water engineering came first? What if ancient cultures created sophisticated systems of channels, reservoirs, and earthworks for agricultural or ceremonial purposes, and later engineers, recognizing the strategic value of the elevated earthworks and surrounding water, incorporated these existing structures into their military designs? This theory does not require lost civilizations. It simply requires us to be more careful about what we assume was built for military purposes versus what was built for other purposes and later adapted. It asks us to hold the military explanation more lightly and look more carefully at the layers of history that may lie beneath a structure we call a star fort. We have traveled far in this documentary. From the aerial view of Palma Nova to the Ottoman cannons at Constantinople, from the Trace Italienne to the maps of Tartaria, from sacred geometry to resonance physics to hydraulic infrastructure. It is time to put the pieces on the table and look at them honestly. What do we know? We know that star forts exist. We know their geometry is extraordinary. We know the military explanation for that geometry is sound and well documented for many of the most famous examples. We know that documentation is incomplete for others. We know that similar geometric forms appear in pre-modern cultures across the world in contexts that have nothing to do with cannon defense. We know that the label Tartaria was applied to a vast territory on European maps for 5 centuries and then disappeared. We know that alternative theories about that disappearance circulate widely and contain a mixture of legitimate questions and unsupported claims. What do we not know? We do not know the complete history of every star-shaped earthwork on Earth. We do not know whether any of these structures predate the military engineering tradition that mainstream history assigns them to. We do not know whether the geometric tradition has roots older than the Renaissance. We do not know whether the erasure of the Tartaria label from maps concealed something significant or was simply the unremarkable consequence of political change. The Tartaria theory, as it currently exists in online communities, is not a rigorous historical argument. It is a cultural phenomenon, a collective expression of distrust in official narratives, combined with genuine curiosity about architectural anomalies, seasoned with significant amounts of misinformation and wishful thinking. It does not meet the evidentiary standards that professional historians apply to claims about the past. But professional history does not always ask every question worth asking. Academic careers are built on caution. Funding flows toward established frameworks. The incentive to pursue the radical alternative explanation, even when the evidence might reward it, is weak in comparison to the incentive to work within the existing paradigm. This is not a conspiracy, it is simply how institutions work. The most intellectually honest position is this: the mainstream explanation for starforts is the best supported explanation we currently have. It should be the default assumption, and the alternative theories, in their current form, do not meet the standard of evidence required to displace it. But the questions embedded in those theories, about precision, about distribution, about what we don't yet know about the geometric capabilities of pre-modern cultures, deserve serious attention from serious researchers. The engineers who built Palmanova and Bortange and Petropavlovskaya were not minor figures. They were among the most sophisticated mathematical minds of their age. They deserve our astonishment. They deserve our respect. They deserve to be understood as the extraordinary human beings they were, without needing to be transformed into the agents of a lost civilization to make them remarkable. Because they are remarkable enough. The shape they built, and the thousands of other shapes like it scattered across this planet, are remarkable enough. The question is not whether something mysterious is happening. The question is whether we are capable of holding the wonder of what we can prove, alongside the humility of acknowledging how much we cannot yet explain. We began this film above the Earth, looking down at a star in the Italian countryside, a shape so precise it seemed to have been placed there by forces beyond ordinary human reckoning. We have spent 50 minutes with this shape. We have measured its angles and traced its motes and read the names of the engineers who drew its plans. We have followed it across the world, to a swamp in the Netherlands, to a river island in Russia, to colonial outposts on 5 continents. We have listened to the military historians explain it, and we have listened to the alternative researchers question it. We have sat with the ambiguity. And here, at the end, is what we are left with.
The world is older than we think it is. Not in years, we know how many years the Earth has circled the Sun, but older in human depth, older in accumulated ingenuity, older in its capacity to produce from creatures who began with no tools and no language and no mathematics, the kind of mind that can look at a flat piece of ground and see, in its imagination, a perfect star. Every star fort on Earth is a monument to that capacity, regardless of who built it, or when, or for what layered purposes. It stands as evidence that the human mind, given a problem hard enough, will find a solution beautiful enough to last centuries. The Tartaria theory may be wrong in its specifics. The resonance hypothesis may be unfounded. The infrastructure-first interpretation may be a minor footnote in architectural history. but all of them are expressions of the same human impulse, the refusal to believe that what we have been told is the whole story, the insistence that the world is stranger, deeper, more layered than the official account suggests. That impulse is not always right, but it is never entirely wrong. Because here is the truth about history. It is written in fragments, by the powerful, about the powerful, for the powerful. What survives is a fraction of what happened. What we know is a fraction of what was known. The past is a vast, dark ocean, and history is the light we manage to cast across it, illuminating some things with extraordinary precision, leaving others in permanent shadow. Star forts live at the edge of that light. We can see them clearly enough to measure their angles and name their architects, but we cannot always see all the way to their foundations. We cannot always trace every layer of purpose and meaning that accumulated in these structures over the centuries they have stood. And maybe that is enough. Maybe the appropriate response to a star carved into the earth is not certainty, not the certainty of the military historian, and not the certainty of the alternative researcher. Maybe the appropriate response is something older than certainty, something that the engineers of Palmanova must have felt when they drove the first stake into the Italian soil, sighted down their measuring chains, and began to impose a perfect shape on an imperfect world. Maybe the appropriate response is awe. The world is full of shapes that shouldn't exist, shapes too precise, too widespread, too beautiful to be explained by any single story. The Star Fort is one of them. It will outlast this film. It will outlast every theory we have proposed and every theory we haven't thought of yet. It will sit in its moat of water with its perfect angles and its centuries of silence, and it will keep asking the question. The shape is a question. You are the answer. What do you think? Were star forts purely military engineering, or is there more to the story? Drop your theory in the comments, and if this film made you look at history differently, share it with someone who loves a good mystery.